This video is about creating a plan for a comparative analysis. Now, in this case, we're assuming it's going to be an essay, but it could also be a speech or anything along that line. The goal here is to come up with a plan for a number of paragraphs and the required content that we need to begin starting to write an essay. It's very much about thinking processes and really taking you from the selection of your texts to the point where you're ready to start writing. For my example, I'm going to be comparing two texts, and that's the book of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck and also The Shawshank Redemption, which is the film. Now, because I'm comparing a book and a film, I'm not going to be delving too deeply, particularly in this video, into the filmic and kind of written devices in each of these. I'm going to be talking more generally about storytelling devices or narrative devices, and that's really things like characterization, setting, symbolism, and the like. I'm going to be giving you two strategies that you can use to extract themes, techniques, and examples from your texts. And once you've got that idea, once you've got those three things, that's when you're really ready to start writing. Now, the first thing you need to recognize is that in order for me to compare these two texts, I need to analyze them both individually. So the next two strategies I'm going to give you are about analyzing both. So I'm going to be putting mine into The Shawshank Redemption. What I need you to imagine is that I would have done the same thing for Of Mice and Men. So you'll do the same thing for both of your texts. I'm giving you two strategies. The one might better suit your text than the other, but this is just two ways that you can go about using your text to get some decent themes, techniques, and content relationships. Okay, so I hope that this works for you. So let's look at strategy one for an individual analysis. So I'm using The Shawshank Redemption as an example of this. What I want you to do in this case is to brainstorm two lists. The first list is going to be ideas you have for what the text might be about. Okay, so it's some brainstorming. I'm going to try and come up with as many as I can. And the second list, which at this point is unrelated to the first list, is that I want you to brainstorm or think about all the notable elements in the text that stood out to you. Okay, so let me show you how this is done. So I thought about The Shawshank Redemption, and here's the list that I came up with. Okay, so I just said to myself, what do I think this is about? Freedom. Any movie that's really about prisons or people being put in prison and particularly trying to escape tends to be about freedom. I thought about maybe this idea of innocence and guilt, because at the beginning the main character Andy is found guilty even though it turns out that he's innocent, but then when he's inside, he kind of gets accused of all of this other stuff. So there's this really interesting thing about guilt and innocence between it. So I thought that might be an interesting theme to discuss. Friendship is a really big part in this. The character Andy and the character Red become really close, and as a result they seem to kind of get each other through the hard times. That made me think about overcoming hardship. They get stuck in this awful prison and it's really difficult and challenging, and they sort of have to rise above it. During that, they go through quite a lot of suffering. So that was just another word that I brainstormed, thinking, oh yeah, well, they do suffer. So this is a good example of human suffering. But there's also some trust in there, and that's kind of related to the friendship. But like I said, at this point, I was just brainstorming the ideas that came to my head. Hope, I thought, was a really big one. And I felt really good about that, even though it wasn't my first idea. So this idea of being able to lose it or find it or anything along that line. And justice is another one. And that's kind of related to innocence and guilt as well. So you see, when I'm brainstorming, I'm not really worried about whether I'm repeating myself or not. I was just, when I thought about the text, these were the words that really came to mind. Okay, so I might play around with them a bit later and you'll see an example of that, but here's where I started. So from here, I thought about, all right, what's the notable content? And I tried to categorize it into the device that sort of represents. You don't have to do it like this, but I just found it easier. So in this case, here were all of the different things, all the different elements that really, for me, came together to show like these are the elements that construct the story. So the beginning part was really easy. I just listed all the main characters, all the characters I thought were significant. So Andy and Red are the main two characters. There's a character in there called Brooks, who's this kind of old guy who ends up kind of getting out of prison and things don't go very well. But I thought that was really significant. It stuck with me, so I wrote him down. And the warden was a similar example of that. You know, he's this kind of he's really the bad guy of the story, so I just wrote him down. I thought about some of the settings. Like I was thinking about the prison, like the fact that it's set in this awful prison could have some kind of significance. And there's also this library in the prison they do a lot of work in to build, and I thought, well, that's again part of the setting, but it's also sort of symbolic because it changes a lot. In terms of symbolism, I tried to think about objects that turn up throughout the whole thing. So I thought about the chess pieces that Andy's making. I thought about the rock hammer. He talks at one stage, well, the film ends with him in Mexico, which is, he talks about this is the world of freedom, or a place where it has no memory. So I just wrote that down. Whether it's relevant or not, I'm not sure. I was also, when I went back and looked over the film, I realized it's narrated by Red, the character Red. So I just made note of that because that may or may not be useful. There's also some stuff in the outside world. When people get out of prison, they're kind of stuck in the outside world, so I wrote that down. And I also just made this note about the narrative structure, like, because they kind of show he escapes, but they don't show the escape until later in the film. So I just thought that was interesting, the way that they chose to tell the story. So what I've got at the moment are two distinct lists, okay, and they were easy to come up with because I didn't have to think too much. I wasn't trying to come up with the answer straight away. I was trying to just list these things separately. So what I've got is a list of ideas for themes and a list of content. So you might guess the next step, but looking at these two things together, then I can start to think about maybe the relationships between them. And what I'm looking for is to find a strong relationship between a theme and some content, which in this case is linked to a technique. So really simple, so if I think about the idea of friendship, what's that linked to? Well, I'm talking about the character of Andy and I'm talking about the character of Red. Okay, so I could, I could write a paragraph about the theme of friendship and how it's shown through the characterization of Andy and Red. Okay, I could look at this idea of maybe, freedom, like the idea of breaking out, or this kind of idea of freedom, and that one could maybe again be linked to Andy. But there's some actually quite negative views on freedom, which is linked to the character of Brooks as well. So that could be part of a discussion. Overcoming hardship and suffering, this idea of everything they have to go through. Well, the prison would be a great thing to talk about there, like the setting of the prison, and maybe even the warden, because he kind of represents that hardship. He kind of characterizes the hardship that they face. When I thought about this idea of hope, again, Andy is a great character to represent that, but I also thought that the library and maybe the chess pieces and the rock hammer kind of linked to that as well, because he's kind of got this plan, this hope of escape, and that keeps him going, which I just thought was really interesting. There's this idea of justice, and they talk a lot about justice in the world, but also in the prison, and I thought maybe Red's narration links to that really well. So look, what you can really see, I'm not going to go through all of them in a huge amount of detail, but what you can see is I've made connections between ideas that I had for the film and elements that were in there. So each of these now becomes the potential for what could be a standalone paragraph or something to compare. All right, so hopefully you can see how this strategy has allowed me to brainstorm what could potentially be something I look at in regards to this. So I might get another piece of paper and I could write down, this idea of saying, all right, well, as a theme, let's say maybe I could do freedom. As a technique, I could look at characterization, and as content, I could look at Andy and Red. Or I could look at Andy in this case because he's the one who broke out. This kind of thing becomes the basis for a really good point. Okay, and we might have talked about that in the past. So that's one strategy you can use. Let me now give you another strategy. Now, look, you might pause this video here and say, actually, I'm just going to try that and see how it works out. But look, if you try that and you can't come up with anything, particularly because you just weren't able to brainstorm themes off the top of your head, here's another way to go about it. Okay, so here's another thinking model you can use to generate themes. So in strategy 2, you're going to look at the beginning and the end of the text, and you're going to make a list of what has noticeably changed from the beginning to the end. So then you're going to think about why it's changed and what this might represent. Okay, so this is just another way of thinking and generating ideas. So here's the list I came up with. All right, I'm moving through this relatively quickly, but at the beginning of the text, Andy's kind of convinced and sent to prison. At the end, he breaks free. Okay, so there's a significant change over the entire course of the text about Andy being convicted and imprisoned and then moving across to becoming free. All right, so that was a change. At the beginning, one of the first scenes you see is the character Red begging for release. But at the end of the text, you see that same scene where he's up for parole, but he doesn't care anymore, so he just gives it to the parole board. So that was another significant change. The library at the beginning is a really small, neglected space, but at the end, it grows into kind of one of the biggest libraries in America. So it has this really significant change, and Andy's very much behind it, but I just thought that was something I could think about. The warden at the beginning, when you first meet him, he says, I believe in two things, kind of something in the Bible, like he's shown to be really caring and religious. But the more you get to know him, you see he's actually quite deceitful and corrupt. And that kind of feeds into this next thing I thought about, where Andy is sent in, he's innocent, but he gets sent to prison. And he makes this comment about how he breaks all of these laws once he's in prison because he's doing all their accounting and there's a lot of fraud and tax evasion and stuff like that. And I also thought, like, at the beginning, no one or society doesn't really seem to be aware of what's happening in the prison. But by the end, everyone knows. So there's this kind of idea about, I don't know, maybe justice or revelation. So once I created this list, then I was able to brainstorm what theme might be looking there. So, if you look at that first one that I circled, Andy's convicted and sent to prison, but then he breaks free. Well, what's that really talking about? Well, in this case, freedom was the word that came to mind. And you can see here how I've used that kind of change to suggest some similar themes or some words that maybe describe the reason behind that change. Okay, so what I'm really trying to show in this case is just how I was able to come up with ideas for one text. And when I did this for the other text, then I could compare the ideas and see if I had any similarities or differences that I could discuss in my major essay. It might seem a bit long-winded, but you'd be surprised. You can probably do this in about half an hour and it'll really set the direction of where you need to go. Now, like I said, I'm not going to do this for both of my texts. What I'm trying to do is model the strategy for you. So the idea is you would do this for each of your texts, and then you should have two grids or two tables in front of you that you can compare. And just an extension here, you can see I've highlighted some of these features just to demonstrate where the techniques might be. I'm just looking for words that I repeated. Anyway, moving on. So then I start to look at both of my texts, and now I start to think, okay, well, what are some of the similarities I'm seeing? So when I did this for both of my texts, I discovered that both texts had a similar theme of showing men in desperate times or facing desperation. Both came back to that idea of hope, and both kind of revealed the strengths and weaknesses of men. They were both texts about men who were in desperate circumstances, and as a result, they went to really extreme lengths to kind of sort themselves out. So that was something I saw that was similar. Once that happened, once I started to see similar themes, then I started to think about content. Okay, so you can see here, I started to say, okay, well, if I was going to talk about men set in desperate times, what would I talk about? Well, I could say one set in the prison and one set in the Great Depression, so that would be my evidence. Characterization, both have these really hopeless characters who just suffer for the whole text. So, you can see in each of these cases, then I started to plan out what some of the different content and techniques would be if I chose to compare these. Just to make sure it was going to work. I did the same thing for differences. I thought the fact they kind of end really differently, and I thought that was a significant difference because that really affects the intended message. So again, I put down some notes, and you can go back and look at these in more detail, that just made me think about, all right, so if I was going to talk about this, if this was going to be a focus, what kind of things would I look at? So I just did some dot points, and in some cases you'll notice I only came up with 2 or 3 things in each list, but the reason for that is because when I put some themes together, or when I tried to contrast some themes, I couldn't really come up with a lot of detail. So that was a filtering process for me. Now look, from here, once I started to do this thinking, then I went to my planning for my actual essay. So by this stage, what I've really been doing this whole time is just brainstorming, okay? But I've brainstormed to the point where I've thought about heaps of different themes, techniques, and content combinations I can use in each text. I've looked at them together, thought about what's going to work together, and then from there, I've been able to think about how I can actually plan my paragraphs. So I've mentioned to you before, I think the best way to plan a paragraph, or before you start writing a paragraph, I think you need to have an idea of the themes that you're going to use, the techniques of how those themes are shown, and the examples or the content you're going to use to reinforce that. So with that in mind, this is what I came up with. All right. Now, again, I'm not going to read everything to you here, but what you can see is that my paragraphs have all got distinct themes. Some of them are quite similar. Like you'll notice I actually I saw this idea of hope, and you would have seen above in the previous section of the video where I stumbled onto the idea of hope. It wasn't the first idea I had when I was thinking of themes, it was one of the last ones. But when I started to really think about it for both texts, I actually realized it was a really strong kind of ongoing element. So I've ended up talking a lot about hope in all of my paragraphs, but I've looked at it in different ways using different techniques. Okay, so hopefully this just goes to show you your goal before you can start writing your essay is to come up with a plan like this, so that you're really clear on what it is you're going to talk about, what techniques you're looking at, and the content you're going to use. To do that, you really need to go through quite a substantial brainstorming process where you think deeply about each text. Hopefully the strategies I've given you will work for you. You know, you don't have to use both of them. The first one might work a charm, but just give them a go, particularly if you get stuck. If you cannot get to a point where you can't fill out this table to give you a sense of where you're going to go, then chances are you're going to really struggle with the essay. So make sure you use this as a resource to try and give yourself some direction. Otherwise, you're going to start writing and you're either going to write something that turns into a bit of a rant, or you're just going to write and sort of get stuck halfway through. So it's really important to make sure you plan, and hopefully this video has given you some good strategies to use.